If you've read ahead, you know that Genesis chapter 34 is a disturbing chapter. This isn't a chapter that any pastor would choose to teach if they teach topically. It's not going to come up in a topical teaching. But because we teach expositionally, chapter by chapter, through the Bible, we come to this chapter that puts a spotlight on a very dysfunctional family. Now, their dysfunction didn't start with Jacob. It included all the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. With Abraham, there was this conflict within his family with his wife Sarah and her handmaiden Hagar and the two sons that came out of those unions. There was dysfunction in the life of Isaac, Abraham and Sarah's son, because Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau was Isaac's favorite son. Jacob was his wife, and then Jacob, Rebekah, his wife's, her favorite son was Jacob. So they each had their favorite kid, and conflict developed, and the dysfunction went on for all of Isaac's lifetime, and it's actually still happening today. The conflict between the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau. So now we get to Jacob's family. And it's like each generation just gets worse and worse, which is notable because these are the first men God chose to form the nation of Israel. I hope you're encouraged by that because many of us, if not all of us, have a dysfunctional family. It's just a matter of degrees, right? Some have greater degrees of dysfunction than others. Now, as for Jacob, as a person, as an individual, he was a deceiver. His name meant heel grabber, heel catcher, but that name came to mean con man, a trickster, deceiver. So that's what he was as a person, but as a husband and as a father, he was passive. Remember, he had 2 wives, but really 4 because each of his wives had a handmaiden who they offered to Jacob to produce more children. They were all competing as to who would have the most children, the most kids. And during this whole competition, Jacob seems to be totally passive. He's just going along with it, like, oh yeah, whatever you say, okay, yeah, whatever you want. And we see that here again in chapter 34. He is passive now in his role as a father, as the head of his household. One major red flag in this chapter is that the name of God does not appear once. It appeared previously in previous chapters. It will appear again in the next chapter, chapter 35. But in chapter 34, there is no mention of God. And that red flag shows us that God's wisdom is not sought, nor is it applied in any of the activities of Jacob's family. Now, do you remember the place where God made himself known to Jacob and what that place became known as? It was called Bethel, Beth-El, house of God. It was a place that God spoke to Jacob, and Jacob built an altar to the Lord there. It was a place of worship and fellowship. Bethel is where Jacob should have gone after he met his brother Esau. He should have gone back to Bethel to meet with God once again and to influence his family, to say, hey, kids, let me tell you about what happened in this place and what God has done for me and what he's done for you. But he doesn't go to Bethel. We saw in Genesis 33 that he went to 2 places. First, he went to a place called Succoth, and then he later moved to a place called Shechem. He told his brother Esau, hey, I'm going to meet you in Seir. His brother Esau was going to Seir, and he said, oh, I'll meet you there. I'm right behind you. Just go ahead. I'll meet you there. But he doesn't go there. He doesn't go back to Bethel. Instead, he and all his family go to Shechem. His 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, the 2 handmaidens, and his 11 sons and 1 daughter named Dinah all came back to the promised land. Shechem is in the land of Canaan, but in an extremely pagan area. It's a pagan neighborhood. It's a bad neighborhood he's taken them to. And in moving to Shechem, he places his entire family in jeopardy. That's the thing about decisions, isn't it? Whatever we decide to do, wherever we decide to go, those we love, those who are a part of us, we can place them in a place of blessing when we are in God's will, or a place of danger if we're out of God's will. We can put them in jeopardy. And so we never sin alone. the people around us suffer as well. So as disturbing as this chapter is, perhaps God will use it to get a hold of you and your own spiritual values and priorities and get you back to the place of blessing, back to Bethel, the house of God, the place God has called you to be, where he is number one in your life. May it serve as a wake-up call for all of us, and especially to the men, to husbands, to fathers, to leaders in the home. Maybe it's, if you're a single mom, you're the leader of your home, you're the head of your household. Maybe it's a wake-up call for all of us to grow in how we lead ourselves and how we lead our families and others. I titled this message, A Lapse in Leadership. We will see three things that result from Jacob's lapse in leadership. First is defilement. Let's read the first 4 verses together. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and violated her. His soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this young woman as a wife." Now, this begins one of the most shameful incidents in Israel's history, and it begins with a terrible crime committed against Dinah, the daughter of Leah. Jacob brought his family to a region in the Promised Land that God did not want them to be in. And you could say that Jacob chose Shechem instead of Bethel for all the wrong reasons. In chapter 33, verse 18, it says that he wanted to be close to the city. But that city is going to have a strong and ungodly influence upon his family. And Jacob's poor choice of a place to live left his family exposed to ungodly influence. So it says here in verse 1, Dinah went out to see the daughters of the land. Now, Dinah's desire to do this was understandable. Young people long for socialization. It's just part of what's ingrained within most young people. Dinah's likely 15 or 16 here at this time. She's in a new place, and she wants to socialize, right? That's totally normal for any teenager. But given the nature of this pagan Hivite neighborhood, you would at least think mom would say, "Hey, you're not going out alone. You've got all these brothers. They're going to go with you." But there's no indication that Dinah was accompanied by her brothers. She just goes out to see the daughters of the land. So the desire to do that was understandable, but it was unwise. And Dinah's father, Jacob, didn't see to it that she was properly supervised and protected. And allowing for this unsupervised socialization in an immoral community was a failure of responsibility on the part of Jacob and Leah. Now, look, we don't know the family dynamics between Dinah and her parents. It's possible that Dinah may have gone out in just complete disregard to the guidance of her parents. Maybe they warned her. Maybe they did the best they could. Maybe they didn't. But she shouldn't have even been put in this position to begin with, living here in this area. But this is a dangerous situation. Henry Morris, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, noted this: unattached young women were considered fair game in cities of that time, in which promiscuity was not only common, but in fact a part of the very religious system itself. And Canaanite society at that time was totally depraved, and it would become even more depraved in the coming centuries. But God didn't want this family that he had chosen to have a crucial role in his unfolding plan of redemption to mingle and especially to be absorbed by this Canaanite society. He didn't want them to be absorbed or be around them socially, culturally, or genetically. And with the low standard of morals that existed among the Canaanites of that time, it was just understood that unattended women, an unattended female could be taken, used, and even raped. And that they would just be compensated later. After the fact, they would take care of it. So it was a dangerous thing for Dinah to go out unaccompanied to see the daughters of the land. And it could be said that Jacob's lack of attention and protection was at least partially and really ultimately at fault with this tragedy. Again, we don't know all the dynamics, Maybe Dinah snuck out. We don't know. But we do know that the compromises that Jacob made in his own life, like lying to his brother Esau about meeting him in Seir, and all the other compromises and his passive approach with his wives made him less able to stand up with any authority to lead his family and guide them as he should. Jacob's children knew that their father had told Esau that he was going to go down south and meet him in Seir. But Jacob went north instead. They saw it. They observed their father. Jacob's kids would pick up on this and other areas of compromise, and they would use them to justify their own compromise. And this is a practical reminder for believing parents. You must live it out before your children. Now, we all understand that you're never going to be able to do that perfectly. You can't be a model of perfection. That's just not reality. But you can be a model of confession and repentance. That when you do mess up, you acknowledge it. You own up to your mistakes and use that as a teaching moment with your kids. Hey, I blew it here. I shouldn't have been this way. I shouldn't have said this. Or use those opportunities to confess and to repent and change. We're not going to do this perfectly. But if you live in compromise, whether it's known to the family or not, don't be surprised if your children follow your footsteps in similar compromise. And that's what we see here, and it was to Dinah's detriment. Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, and he took her, and he lay with her, and violated her. Now, notice the words, see, took, violated. There's some similarities to what we saw in Eve. When she saw the fruit, she saw it, she looked, she wanted it, she took it. It also reminds me of Genesis 6, verse 2, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, so they saw, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And verse 3 says, his soul was strongly attracted to Dinah. He even spoke kindly to the young woman. And though it says in verse 3 that he loved the young woman, it wasn't the true love, the true definition of love. It's not the definition of love we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Because the text tells us here, he violated her. So now Shechem, he's the son. Hamor is the father. And this city is also called Shechem. So either the city is named after the boy or the boy was named after the city. It's probably the first because verse 2 says he's called the prince of the country. So this young man was the prince of the country. He's the entitled prince in a pagan land. And notice how he talks to his own father in verse 4. Get me this young woman as a wife. He's giving orders to his father. Get her for me. So Dinah fell in with the wrong crowd. She's in the wrong place, in the wrong crowd. She's curious. She wants to meet the other girls. And in falling in with the wrong crowd, she is violated. And to be clear, she was raped. And then he says, Shechem, the boy, says, I love you. And he tells his dad, I love her. Get her for me as a wife. Whatever attraction Shechem had for Dinah, it was a soulish attraction. It was emotional, but it was a false love, not true love. Shechem was attracted to Dinah for what she could be for him, for what she could give him, not what he could be for her or what he could give to her. And his forceful violation of Dinah, followed by his immediate demand for her to be his wife, shows us who Shechem really is. This has nothing to do with real love. Now, there is a typical pattern for young men. It's not always this way, but it is often this way. And I'm speaking of worldly, fleshly young men in a typical sort of way will give love to get sex. They will say, I love you, when in reality they love themselves and they love what you can give them in terms of sex. So the typical pattern is young men will often give love to get sex, and conversely, young women will often give sex to get love. Because what they really want is love. They want to be accepted. They want friendship and intimacy on a relational level. But you have a guy who says, I love you, and he's saying that not because he loves her, but because he wants sex. And so she wants to be loved, especially when he turns on the charm. He becomes the prince, as it were, who says, not only do I love you, I can't live without you. And if you really love me, then you'll give me what I want. And then you discover he is no Prince Charming at all. And here we see Shechem, prince of the country, violating Dinah, defiling the daughter of Jacob, ultimately because of a lapse in leadership. But then we move on to deception. The second thing we see as a result of his lapse of leadership, deception, verse 5. And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. Now his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. And the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved and very angry because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing which ought not to be done. Now, this passage gives the impression that Jacob's sons were far more offended and outraged than Jacob was. It's not the father who's outraged and offended, it's the brothers. Jacob's, it says, held his peace until his sons returned from the field. And Jacob's passive response opens the door for two of his sons to do something terrible in response. We see a leadership principle here. Jacob was the God-given, God-appointed head of his family. Now his sons were grown. They're all adults, probably in their 20s at this time. But Jacob is the leader, and he has the leadership role over his family. And when God-appointed heads of households fail to take appropriate leadership, it creates a leadership vacuum, a leadership void. And this void can often be filled in sinful ways. And that's exactly what we're going to see here, because Jacob did not take a leadership role in setting this wrong right, at least to the best of his ability. That void, that leadership vacuum was going to be filled by some of his sons. And it tells us in verse 7 that the sons of Jacob were grieved and very angry. In ancient Middle Eastern cultures, and sometimes in modern Middle Eastern cultures, they have a strong sense of family honor, strong enough that they would use violence to defend that sense of honor. And here, the brothers had a greater sense of honor to protect their sister than their father did. Now, notice the mention of Israel in verse 7. It's not as a person. Jacob was named Jacob, and then he was renamed Israel, right? But for the first time, Israel is mentioned here as a nation. But they're not a nation yet. They're only a nation in terms of a group of people forming together in their embryonic state, you might say. And here, the term that refers to the nation of Israel is referring to the people rather than the nation. It's not the property of Israel, it's not the land of Israel, but the people of Israel, those who have a special covenant relationship with God because of God's relationship with Jacob, the patriarch. But as far as the laws of Israel would be concerned, it is a disgraceful thing, and it will always be a disgraceful thing in Israel, lying with Jacob's daughter in the manner in which this happened, a thing which ought not be done. Now, in those days, it was customary for the entire family to get together and approve of any marriage. It would start with the dads getting together first. They would talk and see if they were compatible from a family standpoint, like, yeah, I've got my son, you've got your daughter. Hey, let's sign a deal. Let's sign this contract right now that they're going to get married. So before the kids know each other or even really know what marriage is, they are engaged, so to speak. Then it would be approved by the entire family. It was a family contract. And that makes sense when you consider that the other person's family is eventually going to be your in-laws and hopefully not outlaws. You never know. They're going to be part of your family or part of your future forever. So you want to make sure that there's a good relationship now. So marriages were arranged, but this here is an emergency situation because there has been a rape. There's been a violation. The fathers get together, the sons come in, but there must be this approval process. So picking up verse 8, but Hamor, that's Shechem's father, Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife, and make marriages with us." So we've moved on. We've elevated this from just with Shechem and Dinah. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters to yourselves. So you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade in it, and acquire possessions for yourselves in it. Then Shechem, now the son speaks, Shechem said to her father and her brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me, I will give. Ask me ever so much dowry and gift, and I will give according to what you say to me. But give me the young woman as a wife." He said, "I'll do anything. I'll pay anything for your daughter." Now, at this point, Jacob had only one daughter, Dinah. But there would be grandchildren born to Jacob and through all the kids, and many of those kids would be daughters. So this conversation isn't just about Dinah. It's about successive generations. Hamor is proposing a long-range plan. But this proposal was a dangerous challenge to the covenant family. This had far greater implications than just two individuals. If Shechem and Dinah get married, it would set a pattern for future marriages between Jacob's family and the people of Canaan. And the result of that would be the eventual and complete assimilation of Jacob's family into Canaanite culture. And remember back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. I know all throughout our study of Genesis, I keep pointing back to Genesis 3:15. That promise that Satan, the serpent, would come and bruise the heel of the Messiah, but the Messiah would crush his head. God promised a lineage, and eventually someone would be born from that lineage that would be the Messiah who would crush the domain of Satan. And ever since that promise, Satan has tried to counteract it by attempting to kill off anyone who could be in this promised line. So as soon as that promise was given, Cain kills his brother Abel, I believe induced by Satan to try to destroy the royal lineage. Well, God raised up Seth as the royal line. But as that line grew and the earth populated, the whole earth became corrupt until God brought judgment on the whole world, the entire world, and everyone on earth would be destroyed, except for 8 people, except for a people. There's always an exception clause, because the royal messianic seed is incorporated in those 8 people, Noah and his family. Well, that warfare just goes on throughout the book of Genesis, and I believe we see it right here. Hamor says in verse 10, "So you shall dwell with us, dwell and trade in the land." Hey, we will marry our kids into each other's families, and we'll just live happily ever after. Come join us. But the future of the covenant family as a distinct people would be at risk if they started to intermarry with the Canaanites. Israel was to be separate from other nations. But in just a few generations, there would be no more covenant family of Israel, because they would just be absorbed into the people of Canaan. That's what normally happens when societies and groups get together. Here, you take a group of 40 or 50 people in Jacob's family and their descendants, put them among a group of tens of thousands of people, and they will eventually intermarry and become part of the larger group, and their individual identity will be lost. That was at risk here with the covenant family. But God had a particular role for the covenant descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had promised them a land, he promised a nation, and a distinct blessing that would extend to every family in the world. He promised that the Messiah would come forth from this family. But if they ceased to be a distinct family or nation or people, then God's promise would not be fulfilled, and the Messiah would never come forth. So you can see what's at stake here. So Hamor and Shechem say to Jacob and his sons, "Whatever you say to me, I will give," there in verse 11. Hamor and Shechem probably thought that they're acting generously, but in their minds. But their manner of negotiating the arrangement of the marriage insulted Dinah and her family even more. Their attitude was like, "Hey, just name your price. We'll make it up to you." They acted as if money and marriage could make the disgrace of Dinah go away. So, how will Jacob's family respond to this offer? Verse 13. But the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor, his father, and spoke deceitfully, because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. And they said to them, we cannot do this thing, to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. But on this condition we will consent to you. If you will become as we are, if every male of you is circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. But if you will not heed us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and be gone. Where did the sons of Jacob learn to do deceitful things? From their father, Jacob. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The Hivites, they're negotiating, and I'll say it this way, they're negotiating in good faith as their moral standards were, according to their own standards. They're open. They're being honest in these negotiations, but not the sons of Jacob. They spoke deceitfully because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. This was a carefully planned deception, and it was presented as a demand in verse 15. On this condition, we will consent to you. If you will become as we are, if every male is circumcised, then, verse 16, we will give our daughters to you. Now, Hamor and Shechem, they're going to agree to such an extreme demand, but they don't react like this was something they'd never heard of, because they knew this was practiced by other nations as well. But that's the offer from the sons of Jacob. Get all the men in your community circumcised. And I don't need to tell you that circumcision upon a male who is older would be even more painful than for a young infant when they're circumcised. If it would leave a man incapacitated for a few days, and they weren't using surgical knives either. This is like flint knives. So I'll leave that description there. But despite the pain and the sacrifice involved, Hamor and Shechem will agree to do this. But they now have to convince all the men to go along with their plan. Verse 18. And their words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. So the young man did not delay to do the thing because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. He was more honorable than all the household of his father. And Hamor and Shechem, his son, came to the gate of their city and spoke with the men of their city, saying, these men are at peace with us. Therefore let them dwell in the land and trade in it. For indeed the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters to us as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men consent to dwell with us, to be one people, if every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised. Verse 23, will not their livestock, their property, and every animal of theirs be ours? Only let us consent to them, and they will dwell with us. And all who went out of the gate of his city heeded Hamor and Shechem his son. Every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city, of his city. Hamor and Shechem are able to persuade the men of the city to go along with it, because beyond the deep attraction that Shechem had for Dinah, the men of the city also liked this idea of being able to marry into the family of Jacob, which was a wealthy and influential family. The wealth of this powerful family would be absorbed into the Canaanite community. But it's interesting that it says in verse 19 that Shechem was more honorable than all the household of his father. From what we've read so far, we would not think he was honorable in any way whatsoever. But among the Canaanites of his time, he was. He was more honorable. And in some sense, he wants to make things right for defiling Dinah. So it's a very twisted, upside-down morality that in which that's presented. But notice the persuasive words that Hamor and Shechem used in verse 23. Will not their livestock, property, and every animal of theirs be ours? Hamor and Shechem convinced the men that it would be worth it because they're able to marry the daughters of and the descendants that come from a very wealthy and influential family. But even more to the point, they would be able to take their livestock, their property, and animals. So Hamor and Shechem have not been totally honest with Jacob, have they? Because back in verse 10, he told Jacob, "So you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade in it, and acquire possessions for yourselves in it." He's saying this will be an economic benefit for you. You'll be blessed, and you will prosper materially if you do this. But when Hamor and Shechem try to sell it to their own men, they say, "Well, not their stuff become ours." So they sell it as this economic opportunity. So the Hivites went along with this because they saw this as an opportunity to absorb these people, Jacob and his family, his livestock and possessions, and increase their own wealth. I do need to say this. There are some Bible commentators who see this as Jacob's sons hoping that these unbelievers would be made right with God in the covenant relationship by being circumcised. That if they go through this ritual of circumcision, that they would be made right. But it's clear. This is clear here. They did this to deceive them and to incapacitate them. That was their motive the whole way, because that's what it tells us. Verse 13 says, "The sons of Jacob answered and spoke deceitfully." So they step in and they fill a leadership vacuum that was created by their father Jacob and his passive response. Notice in all what I just read in this second section, Jacob has not spoken. We hear nothing from him. Well, that leads to our third point, the third thing that results from a lapse of leadership, and that is death. Beginning in verse 25. "Now it came to pass on the third day when they were in pain that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males." Simeon and Levi were no doubt assisted by some servants that were helping them, but each took his sword and killed all the males. Their thought was, hey, if these guys get circumcised, they'll be incapacitated, they'll be in pain, they won't be able to move. It will give us this military advantage over them, and we'll just kill them all. And that's what happened. Now, Dinah and these two sons, Simeon and Levi, they were sons of Jacob through the same mother, Leah, the unloved wife, if you recall. Rachel was the one who was loved. Leah was the older sister, but she was the unloved wife of Jacob. So these two sons were full brothers of Dinah and felt more of a connection, obviously more than the brothers who were the half-brothers to her. They were full brothers, but so were Reuben, who was the oldest. Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun were also full brothers, having Leah as their mom and Jacob as their dad. But they don't react the same way. So why did these two react violently and aggressively? We don't know exactly, but perhaps in their own rationale, and we see by their actions, they had perhaps this idea that, hey, dad's not going to do anything. So he's not going to step in and stand up for his daughter. Somebody has to defend her honor. That seems to be their attitude. And these two acted violently. This wasn't just a deceptive act. This is a massacre of a whole city of men. And it disgraced the sign of the covenant, of God's covenant. God said that he gave circumcision to Abraham and his covenant descendants as a sign of the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant. Simeon and Levi took something God intended to be a sacred sign of the covenant and used it to get revenge and to cause death. Simeon and Levi show themselves to be children of Jacob. I mean, remember his name means heel catcher, and it was associated with being a deceiver, a con man. And they come up with this bold plan to massacre an entire city of men under the cover of their acceptance of the demand to be circumcised. But it was boldness that was not in the cause of good. It was boldness in the cause of evil. That tells us that boldness in and of itself is not necessarily a good characteristic. It's boldness to do what? For them, it was to do evil. And this shows Simeon and Levi had extremely hard hearts. Continuing now, verse 26. And they killed Hamor and Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because their sister had been defiled. They took their sheep, their oxen, and their donkeys, what was in the city and what was in the field, and all their wealth, all their little ones, and their wives they took captive. And they plundered even all that was in the houses. The sons of Jacob claimed to justify this murder and theft by saying that their sister had been defiled and disgraced and that their family had been dishonored. That was all true. That all did happen. But the punishment was excessive. The massacre of an entire city was beyond what justice would demand. Now, later in the law of Moses, when it was instituted, there would be a law. You know it. Everybody knows it, Christian or not. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Exodus 21:24. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Now, some people read that and think, well, what a vengeful God. No, you don't understand. That law was put in place to limit vengeance, not to enable vengeance. Because human nature is, hey, if you take out one of my eyes, I'm going to take out both of your eyes. You hit me in the face and knock out a tooth, I'm going to hit you back and knock out all your teeth. That's human nature. It's not to match the crime, it's to exact revenge and to go beyond the crime. So the eye for eye, tooth for tooth was to limit vengeance so that the punishment would be fitting of the crime. Justice says that the degree of the punishment must be proportional to the crime. To massacre an entire city of men because of the crime of one man is not justice. That is vengeance. But they not only killed all the men, they took the sheep, the oxen, and plundered the entire city. Notice in verse 27, Simeon and Levi lead the charge in the killing. But it appears that all the rest of the sons of Jacob were complicit because all the sons of Jacob plundered the town. This horrific chapter shows the sinfulness and the depravity of the Canaanites, but it also shows the sinfulness and depravity of the sons and the family of Jacob. So how is Jacob going to respond? Is he going to step up and lead his family to make restitution for their actions? Is he going to take responsibility for his lapse in leadership? Verse 30. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me. I shall be destroyed, my household and I." That's a whole lot of me's and I's in there. Jacob never got angry for the rape of his daughter. He never rebuked Shechem or Hamor. He does rebuke his sons, but he doesn't rebuke them for the massacre. He doesn't rebuke them for abusing the right of circumcision. He doesn't rebuke them for the breach of contract. He rebukes them for what they did to him in giving him a bad name. Jacob is more concerned about his reputation than his daughter, than the murder, than the massacre, the abuse of the spiritual right of circumcision. It's like, hey, you made me obnoxious. They're not going to like me. My reputation is ruined. And all Simeon and Levi can say is, verse 31, should he treat our sister like a harlot? That's their only response. Now, years later, we're fast forwarding now, but years later at the end of the book of Genesis, when Jacob is about to die, he prophesied over each of his 12 sons. And with Simeon and Levi, he prophesies that both tribes would be divided and scattered. A bit late for a rebuke, but that prophecy did come true. So the name of God is not mentioned once in this chapter. And this lack of God led to a lapse in leadership. Jacob led his family not to Bethel, not to the place of worship and fellowship with God. He went to Shechem, the place of pagan idolatry, which put his family in great jeopardy. Now, as we wrap this up, I want to be tender, but I also want to be upfront for parents. Parents, think about the environments that you allow your kids to be in. And don't be surprised when your children start adopting the values of other children. If you put your children I'm talking about pagan environments, don't be surprised when they start to talk and start to act like the other kids, because that's all they're around. And when your children start going to the wrong places, perhaps as they get older, they start going to the wrong places, doing the wrong things at the wrong times, things that you know they shouldn't be involved in, then you need to step in and do something and say something to counteract it. In the New Testament, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? I know we use that verse about marriage, and that is absolutely true, but it's not just about marriage. This is about any aspect of life, of anyone who has a different value system. You know, there's a lot of peer pressure, and if there's no pressure to counteract that pressure that they have in the world, they'll collapse. Peer pressure must be countered by parental pressure, the good kind, the loving kind, the active kind, the involved kind. Now, how that looks in your situation with your kids, it's going to look different. You need to seek the Lord. You need to seek His Word about what that looks like. But seek the Lord on that. Now, I know that's a firm word, but I also want to say this. As for Jacob, we see he's flawed. But you know what? Isaac was flawed. Abraham was flawed. Come to think of it, I'm flawed. And you're flawed. We're all flawed. Everyone is flawed except for God. And as flawed as Jacob was, at least give him this, deep within his heart, underneath all the conniving and all the double crossing, he has a desire for spiritual things. That's why he wanted the birthright. He understood the spiritual implications of the birthright that he stole from Esau. Granted, he went about it the wrong way. He lied, he cheated, and connived, but he had a deep desire to serve the Lord. And you're going to see things pick up because this story doesn't end in chapter 34. This sordid tale of defilement and deceit and death doesn't end there. Chapter 35 is what I will call the first revival in the Bible. Jacob gets revived, and he wants his sons, his family to get revived, and he goes back to the place of Bethel, the house of God. He goes back to calling on the name of the Lord, and he goes back to building an altar and worshiping. And he tries to influence his family with that same spiritual value system as he takes leadership in his home. May God give us that same heart to get back to that place of blessing, back to Bethel, the house of God, the place God has called you to be, where He is number one in your life. Let's pray together.